The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. Corcoran State Prison was supposed to be a place where order controlled chaos. Instead, it became a battlefield where the strongest didn't always survive. Only the most adaptable did. In the early 1990s, rival gangs ruled every corner. Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, Fresno Bulldogs. Violence wasn't an exception. It was routine. But inside the storm, one inmate stood out. His name was Preston Tate. Not the most feared, not the most connected, but the one who refused to fold, no matter who came for him. What no one knew was that Tate's final day would expose something far bigger than a prison rivalry. Something planned, something hidden, something deadly. Before the story ends, you'll be forced to ask, was Preston Tate killed by an enemy or by a system that wanted show? If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. The Yard of Kings and Targets. Corcoran State Prison was built to contain the men the streets couldn't. But by the mid-1990s, the facility had grown into something else, its own ecosystem, shaped by fear, alliances, and the unpredictable politics of prison life. Anyone who stepped into the level 4 yards had to understand one rule: nobody walked alone. Not gang leaders, not newcomers, not even the bold ones who claimed neutrality. The prison didn't allow neutrality for long. Preston Tate learned that rule early. He arrived with no formal allegiance, but Corcoran didn't care. The moment he touched the yard, eyes marked him. Tattoos spoke for different tribes. Long histories of bloodshed dictated who stood where, who shared tables, who gave orders. Even the slightest mistake, talking to the wrong person, sitting in the wrong area, walking too close to the wrong group, could earn you an attack before you even understood what went wrong. Tate wasn't the biggest man among them, but he carried himself like someone who wasn't afraid to bleed. That alone made him interesting. In a place full of predators, confidence was either a sign of strength or a death wish. The others watched him closely, waiting to see which one he was. Over time, Preston built a reputation, not because he sought power, but because he kept surviving the things meant to break him. Stabbings, yard brawls, ambushes and blind spots. Rumors said one gang tried to take him out 3 separate times. Another group warned him to stay clear of their tables. A third blamed him for a fight that he didn't start but got caught in the middle of anyway. Yet there he was every morning, walking the yard as if nothing had happened the day before. The guards noticed. The inmates noticed. Everyone did. In a place like Corcoran, survival made you worth watching. It meant you were either protected, dangerous, or too stubborn to quit. And men who were too stubborn became unpredictable, and unpredictable men created problems. By 1993, the yard wasn't just dangerous. It was unstable. The administration made decisions that left the population on edge, mixing rival gangs in the same recreational yards, ignoring warnings from classification officers, placing men with known blood feuds together. Corrections officers claimed they were understaffed and overworked. Inmates claimed something else, something more deliberate. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Violence rose. Every week, another fight. Every month, another stabbing. Weapons kept surfacing despite searches. Men kept leaving the yard on stretchers, some never coming back. And in the middle of all that was Tate. He tried to stay clear of the most extreme groups, but neutrality became impossible. The Bulldogs thought he spoke too much with the wrong people. The Mexican Mafia saw him as too unpredictable to trust. The Aryan Brotherhood didn't like the way he handled himself, too confident, too independent. The black guerrilla family respected his discipline, but didn't consider him one of their own. That left Preston walking a knife's edge. Everyone saw him. No one claimed him, and yet no one could put him down. Earlier altercations only sharpened his survival instincts. He didn't start fights. He ended them. He avoided unnecessary conflict, but never backed down from unavoidable ones. Some inmates admired him. Others feared him. A few hated him for reasons they barely remembered. And those tensions grew even sharper as rumors spread across the tiers. The administration was planning more mixed-yard releases, more rival pairings, more tests of inmate behavior. Tate saw the shift. He noticed certain officers standing at different angles during yard time. He noticed how some groups were agitated for no reason. He noticed the pattern. Certain men were being placed together repeatedly, as if someone was taking notes. Nothing in Corcoran happened by accident. The morning of April 2nd, 1994, started like any other. Breakfast, count, movement. Most inmates walked quietly, saving their energy for the yard. Everyone had someone watching them, and everyone knew they were being watched by staff too. Preston kept a steady pace, returning to the same yard he always used. Nothing stood out. No new faces. No warning from anyone he trusted. Just routine. Routine in Corcoran was the most dangerous thing you could believe in. When the gates rolled open, the yard buzzed with the familiar tension that always came before possible violence. Men walked in pairs or small groups. Gang members took corners. The bulldogs stood near their usual zone. The Mexican mafia clustered by the pull-up bars. AB members took the far left. BGF stayed near the track. Preston scanned everything. A habit. A necessity. Then he stepped forward. Some inmates later said they noticed it first. A rival walking straight toward Tate with fast, determined steps. Others said they saw nothing until the first punch was thrown. Accounts differ, but every version agrees on one thing. The attack came quick. The two men collided. Fists, grappling, dust rising from the concrete. Other inmates stepped back, giving space. Yard fights happened, but this one had a different energy, sharp, sudden, reckless. Preston managed to get a hold on his attacker, twisting, trying to break free, trying to stand, trying to keep himself alive. A few seconds passed, maybe more. The struggle tightened. That's when the shots rang out. It happened fast, faster than most inmates expected. The correctional officer didn't shout warnings long enough. Didn't let the fight break apart. Didn't stop shooting after the first round. One bullet hit the ground. One struck nearby concrete. Another tore through the air and hit Tate. He fell. The yard froze. Some inmates said he was trying to stand up when the shot hit. Others said he was turning away. A few claimed he had his hands up. None of them said he was attacking the officer. The officer later claimed he stopped a deadly assault. But in that moment, silence took over the yard. Preston Tate wasn't moving. He wasn't getting up. And for the first time in years, everyone realized the most dangerous part of Corcoran wasn't always the inmates. Sometimes it was the people in the tower, the whispers behind the walls. The moment Preston Tate went down, the yard transformed from a battlefield into a graveyard-level silence. Men who usually wouldn't flinch at violence stood frozen, watching officers rush in. Boots pounded the concrete. Commands echoed. Weapons were drawn, even though the fight was over. A stretcher arrived too late. Tate's body was carried out of the yard, and every inmate there knew they had just witnessed something that wouldn't stay buried. But what mattered most wasn't the shooting itself. It was what happened after. Corcoran always had its own rumor channels. Messages moved faster than paperwork. A whisper in one building could become a declaration in another by nightfall. And on that day, the whispers spread like wildfire. The shot wasn't clean. The timing was off. Tate was already breaking free. He wasn't armed. He wasn't the aggressor anymore. What started as quiet speculation turned into something else, fear. Not fear of Tate's attacker, not fear of any gang retaliation. Fear of the realization that the guard tower hadn't fired to stop a riot. It had fired for reasons no one could explain. By dinner time, 3 inmates had already filed statements claiming the shooting was unnecessary. By lights out, those inmates were being moved to different housing units. Some called it standard procedure. Others didn't buy it. Corcoran had a pattern. When someone talked too much, they were relocated, isolated, or removed from the yard rotation altogether. Silence didn't come from rules. It came from routine consequences. Inside the program office, the story was more controlled. Officers gathered, giving statements that matched almost perfectly. They said Tate posed a serious threat. They said the attacker had the advantage. They said the shooter acted within policy. They said everything required to make the incident appear clean. But too many inmates saw the fight differently. They saw Tate trying to disengage. They saw the bullets hitting the ground first. They saw the officer fire again, even after the danger had passed. In a crowded prison yard, it was impossible to hide that many angles. The administration tried anyway. Within 48 hours, reports were tightened. Details were polished. Words like retreat, disengage, and accidental were scrubbed from statements. Instead, Tate was described as aggressive, in full assault mode, non-compliant. The attacker became a secondary detail. The tower officer became the hero. But contradictions formed immediately. Medical staff said the bullet entered Tate at an angle inconsistent with him lunging forward. Yard officers mentioned that only seconds passed between the first scuffle and the shooting. Too few for a proper warning. A sergeant questioned why lethal force was chosen instead of non-lethal options. Those doubts didn't make it into the official file. They circulated privately, whispered in hallways, discussed only when office doors were closed. No one wanted to attach their name to a statement that contradicted the narrative forming above them. Not in Corcoran. Not when careers were at stake. Outside the prison, parents demanded answers. Attorneys requested files. Advocacy groups began calling the prison for comment. The administration released a brief written response that claimed the shooting was within the boundaries of necessary force. It should have ended there. But Corcoran wasn't built for quiet endings. As weeks passed, more incidents surfaced, unrelated on the surface, but eerily similar. Rival gangs placed together despite prior warnings, fights erupting seconds after yard gates opened, officers watching from towers with weapons ready. Inmates who were normally kept apart were suddenly being placed in confined areas together. Several of those fights ended with gunfire. Some incidents left men wounded. Others left men dead. To outsiders, these events looked like a prison struggling with gang violence. Inside the walls, inmates told a different story, one that grew louder with each injury. They're staging fights. They're making us gladiators. They want bodies on the concrete. And Tate's death became Exhibit A. The first major break came from an unexpected source, a correctional officer. Quiet, careful, known for keeping to himself. He approached a supervisor and mentioned concerns about mixing rival gangs intentionally. The supervisor told him to focus on his duties. Days later, he transferred units without explanation. Another officer came forward, this one more direct. He claimed yard pairings were set up. He claimed certain sergeants ignored warnings. He claimed the Tate shooting wasn't the first incident mishandled. That officer found himself reassigned too. So inmates stepped in. Some wrote letters to legal groups. Some contacted family members, urging them to reach out to the media. Some filled out grievance forms knowing they'd likely be rejected. They didn't care. They needed a record. The dam finally cracked when 2 whistleblowers went outside the chain of command. They contacted investigators directly, state and federal. They reported staged fights. They reported deliberate mixing of known enemies. They reported officers firing excessively. They reported Tate's death as the clearest example. Suddenly, the prison had problems that couldn't be contained by paperwork. Internal affairs arrived quietly at first, then the Office of the Inspector General, then the FBI. Meetings were held in off-site offices. Staff were pulled one at a time for questioning. Documents were requested. Logs were examined. Video footage, limited, grainy, incomplete, was scrutinized for patterns. Every investigator kept coming back to the same name, Preston Tate. His shooting wasn't just an incident. It was the catalyst. The one event with too many witnesses, too many contradictions, too many red flags. For years, Corcoran had operated in shadows, but Tate's death dragged everything into light. Inside the prison, tension rose. Officers felt watched. Inmates felt emboldened. Management felt trapped. The walls felt tighter. Every conversation was shorter. Every mistake felt heavier. And the question hanging over everything was simple. If Tate didn't die because of an inmate, who caused it? The administration insisted the tower officer followed protocol. The officer insisted he acted in fear for someone's life. Inmates insisted Tate was retreating. Investigators insisted nothing added up. The truth sat somewhere inside that mess, waiting for someone to pull it out. And Corcoran was about to enter the ugliest chapter in its history. The walls start talking. Investigators weren't prepared for what they found when they stepped deeper into Corcoran's operations. At first, they expected another routine review. A questionable shooting, conflicting statements, a few policy violations. But the deeper they looked, the more the case unraveled. Each report, each log entry, each shift rotation pointed toward a pattern that didn't look accidental. The first signs came from yard release logs. The paperwork listed gang affiliations for every inmate, clearly marking enemies who should never share space. Yet investigators found repeated entries showing known rivals being placed together. Not once, not twice, dozens of times, sometimes weekly, sometimes daily. In some cases, the pairings happened minutes after officers documented active threats between those same groups. The pattern was unmistakable. Rivalries weren't being avoided. They were being engineered. One investigator laid out 2 weeks of logs side by side and highlighted the contradictions. Entire sections lit up in red. It was impossible to explain as clerical error. These weren't isolated mistakes. This was orchestration. Inside the prison, the atmosphere changed in ways staff couldn't hide. Some officers whispered to each other in hushed tones. Others avoided eye contact altogether. A few became suddenly helpful, offering information before even being asked. Those were the ones with guilt written on their faces. But the investigators were most interested in the officers who acted too calm, too rehearsed, too confident in their explanations. They recited policy the way a student recites a speech memorized minutes before class. Their accounts of Tate's death were nearly identical, down to the exact phrasing. Investigators recognized that kind of uniformity immediately. It didn't come from truth. It came from preparation. Meanwhile, inmates sensed the shift. Word spread that outside eyes were watching. Some felt vindicated. Others felt nervous. Not because they feared retaliation from other inmates, but because they feared being dragged into a conflict between staff and investigators. In a prison, being labeled an informant, accurately or not, could be deadly. Still, some stepped forward anyway. One inmate described the April 2nd yard release as off from start. He said officers seemed tense before the gates even opened. He said the tower officer kept his rifle pointed longer than usual. He said everyone knew a hit wouldn't come from the inmate population that day. The danger was above them. Another inmate recounted seeing Tate try to disengage from the fight. He described the body angle, the hand placement, the look on Tate's face when the shots were fired. His voice trembled when he told investigators that Tate wasn't fighting anymore. He was trying to get up, he said. He was trying to stop. Multiple inmates repeated the same detail. Tate was pulling away when he was shot. But the most damning testimony came from an inmate who claimed he overheard 2 officers talking days after the shooting. According to him, one officer joked didn't expect him to go down that fast, while the other replied, "Can't control what happens once they're out there." Investigators asked him to repeat the statement 3 times. He didn't change a word. Even though they couldn't prove the conversation happened, the inmate's fear was real. His hands shook. His voice cracked. His eyes darted to the door every few seconds. That kind of fear doesn't come from rehearsing a lie. It comes from believing you might not make it back to your cell alive. In the administrative wing, investigators interviewed supervisors. Some dodged questions. Others claimed they never saw anything unusual. A few pretended the yard pairings were random, but then they were shown the logs. The contradictions, the dates that didn't line up, the decisions that defied every known safety protocol. Excuses fell apart quickly. One supervisor tried blaming a clerical error until investigators pointed out he personally signed off on the releases. Another claimed he never knew Tate or his attacker were rivals, but the gang database proved otherwise. Others tried to pin responsibility on lower-ranking officers who weren't even on duty those days. The moment supervisors realized the investigation wasn't a minor review, panic set in. Tate's death could no longer be explained away as a necessary use of force. And if Tate's death was questionable, investigators wondered, how many other shootings were hidden? How many other fights were staged? How many other men died under suspicious circumstances? They pulled up old reports. They ran audits on prior shootings. They reviewed evidence from years' worth of violent encounters. Patterns emerged everywhere, disturbingly similar patterns. Officers who fired their weapons frequently. Yard pairings that triggered violence. Warnings ignored. Reports rewritten. Supervisors approving everything with no questions asked. The phrase began circulating quietly among investigators. This wasn't chaos. This was choreography. Meanwhile, inside the housing units, inmates watched everything unfold like a movie they'd seen before, but never believed anyone outside the walls would care about. One Bulldog member said he'd been placed with enemy gang members multiple times and survived only by sprinting across the yard before the fight could escalate. A Mexican mafia affiliate said he'd been ordered into a yard he wasn't supposed to be in and was told to deal with it. A BGF member said officers laughed while 2 men brawled on the ground, making no attempt to intervene until gunshots ended it. Then came the biggest blow. A correctional officer, one who had stayed quiet for months, finally snapped. He told investigators that certain supervisors encouraged mixing enemies. He claimed they treated violent encounters as behavior studies. He said officers were told to let them work it out until lethal force became the final option. When investigators asked him why he stayed silent so long, he said, "I didn't think anyone would believe me." Behind closed doors, the prison went into damage control. Emails were sent. Meetings were held. Attorneys were consulted. Public statements were drafted but not released. Administrators questioned each other behind thin walls, raising voices that traveled down hallways. Nobody asked who was responsible. Everybody asked who was going to take the blame. And all of it, every lie, every cover-up, every fear-driven decision, was pointing back to one turning point. The day Preston Tate died. His death wasn't just the spark. It was the spotlight. It illuminated years of manipulation, violence, and misconduct that the administration thought would stay hidden. Investigators knew the truth. They just needed proof strong enough to break the walls wide open. And Corcoran was about to become the center of a storm bigger than any inmate riot the prison had ever seen. The system on trial. The investigation reached a point where silence was no longer possible. Corcoran State Prison, once able to bury incidents under layers of paperwork, found itself dragged into a national spotlight. What began with whispers about yard pairings and a single deadly shooting had become something far bigger. A federal inquiry into whether a state prison had been running illegal fight setups for years. The investigators moved from gathering information to confronting the institution directly. The first move was a series of subpoenas. Records that had been previously misplaced were suddenly located. Logs that had been censored reappeared in their full form. Supervisors who once acted untouchable now sat in front of government officials with trembling hands. The question on the table was simple but devastating. Were Corcoran officers staging inmate fights? The administration denied everything. They insisted the chaos was natural. They painted Corcoran as a battlefield run by gangs too powerful to control. They argued that officers used force only when necessary. They framed every shooting, including Tate's, as the tragic cost of maintaining order. But investigators had something the administration didn't account for: patterns. Pattern of ignored warnings. Pattern of rival releases. Pattern of fabricated reports. Pattern of officers involved in multiple shootings. And the moment patterns arise, isolated incidents become systematic behavior. The hearings began privately. Officers were pulled in one by one, placed under oath, and questioned about every detail of their shift logs, their yard procedures, their weapon discharges. Some stuck to their stories, repeating the rehearsed lines. The inmate posed a threat. It happened too fast. I acted with force necessary to stop violence. But investigators had a tactic, showing them reports from other officers that contradicted their accounts. The moment contradictions appeared, loyalties cracked. One officer, previously confident, began sweating when confronted. He stumbled over his explanation. He contradicted himself. He tried to correct his statements mid-sentence. His certainty evaporated in minutes. Another officer panicked when investigators revealed they had interviews with inmates describing officer behavior. He demanded to know who talked. Investigators didn't answer. A third officer, cornered with evidence of mismatched timelines, asked for a lawyer. Within weeks, 4 officers revised their statements. 2 admitted the yard mixings were dangerous but ordered. 1 acknowledged that supervisors sometimes allowed fights to continue longer than they should. It wasn't a confession, but it was close enough to open the floodgates. Meanwhile, inmates who previously stayed silent started sending written declarations through their attorneys. They described fights that seemed prearranged. They described officers standing in formation before a fight occurred. They described the tone of certain sergeants, cold, amused, detached. One inmate wrote, "They didn't stop the violence. They organized it." Investigators documented everything. The media got a hold of the story next. Headlines appeared. Corcoran accused of staging fights. Did guards turn prisoners into gladiators? Federal probe targets Corcoran shooting. Reporters showed up outside the gates. Cameras filmed the perimeter fence, the guard towers, the long concrete buildings. Former inmates contacted journalists. Families demanded answers about loved ones who had been killed or injured years earlier. The Tate case sat at the center of it all. His death became the example reporters used when explaining the allegations. His name echoed through every press conference, every newspaper, every interview. What happened to Tate wasn't just a tragedy, it was evidence. Inside Corcoran, officers felt the pressure. Some veterans grew paranoid, fearing they'd become scapegoats. Younger officers wondered if they should come forward. Rumors spread of retaliation from within the ranks. Supervisors told staff to stay quiet, reminding them of policies and loyalty. But loyalty meant little when federal agents were circling. Inmates sensed the cracks widening. Some became hopeful, believing justice might finally reach behind the walls. Others feared the instability. Investigations often brought lockdowns, canceled programs, and unpredictable shifts in power. The prison operated on tension thick enough to cut. Then came the courtroom phase. Multiple officers were indicted, not for murder, but for civil rights violations, excessive force, falsification of records, and misconduct. The charges were complex, but the message was clear: the system was on trial. The prosecution laid out documented evidence showing rival inmates being placed together intentionally. They presented log entries proving Tate shouldn't have been in the yard with his attacker. They played audio recordings of interviews where officers contradicted each other. They brought forward expert witnesses who testified that the level of force used in Tate's shooting was inconsistent with protocol. The defense argued the opposite. They blamed gang culture. They accused inmates of lying. They claimed the investigators didn't understand prison operations. They insisted Tate was a danger, a threat, and that officers reacted the only way they could. But evidence is louder than excuses. Still, the trial wasn't simple. Jurors struggled to decide whether these incidents were malicious orchestration or tragic mismanagement. The prosecution painted a picture of deliberate setups. The defense insisted the prison was simply overwhelmed. After months of hearings, the verdicts came down, and the outcome stunned almost everyone. Many officers were acquitted. Some charges were dropped. Others resulted in hung juries. A few officers faced minor consequences, not for violence, but for falsifying reports. Only a small number were punished meaningfully, and even those sentences were far lighter than inmates expected. Inside Corcoran, anger spread. "They got away with it," some inmates said. "The system protects its own," others whispered. The disappointment was real, but the investigation had still accomplished something massive. Corcoran's secrets were out. Policies were rewritten. Yard procedures changed. Oversight increased. Officers were reassigned. Supervisors were removed. What had been done in darkness for years was now under a spotlight that wouldn't shut off. And everywhere investigators turned, one name remained the symbol of everything that went wrong. Preston Tate. His death didn't just expose a pattern. It forced the world to question how many lives had been sacrificed before someone finally spoke up. But the story wasn't over. Because to understand the full truth, investigators had to go deeper into the inmates who tried to expose the system, the retaliation they faced, and what happened after the courtroom lights faded. The final chapter wasn't about how Tate died. It was about what Corcoran became because of it. The night the truth finally surfaced began with an unnatural stillness. One of those dead, airless evenings where even the guards seemed unsettled. In a place like Jersey State Prison, quiet is rarely a blessing. It's a warning. And for the first time since he'd arrived, Thomas felt that warning rising through the concrete beneath his feet. His bunkmate, Junior, sensed it too. "You feel that," Junior whispered, sitting upright, eyes fixed on the cell door. Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. Something was coming. He could feel the tension coiling through the tier, tight, nervous, dangerous. At 11:47 p.m., the power cut. The tier plunged into pitch-black silence. Then came the roar. Doors banged. Boots pounded the metal walkways. Somewhere below, a man screamed. A raw, guttural sound that cut straight through the dark. Junior scrambled up. "This ain't no regular fight. This is a sweep." "Lights don't cut during a sweep," Thomas muttered. His voice stayed low, steady. Fear didn't help, and panic only got you killed. But inside, the gears were turning fast. He knew what this was. A ghost had finally returned. The rumor had spread earlier that day. Barely a whisper, but it hit the cell blocks like a spark in dry leaves. The brother of D-Suite just landed in the prison. A man who wanted answers. And revenge. Not for D-Suite's death itself. Everyone knew the man had brought most of his problems on himself. No, it was the betrayal. The idea that someone he trusted had crossed him. That was the part nobody forgave. And the rumor went further. D-Suite's people now believed Thomas was the one who lured the guard away. Thomas had been expecting the blowback. He wasn't naive. When a man in prison dies, especially a man with a following, someone always gets blamed. And logic had no place behind bars. Now he stood quietly in the dark, knowing exactly what the blackout meant. This wasn't a riot. It was a hunt. A flashlight beam cut through the black, bobbing toward the cell. Shadows moved behind it, 3, maybe 4 figures. Quiet steps. Intentional. Junior backed away, hands trembling. "They're coming here," he whispered. "Bro, they coming here." "Get behind me," Thomas said. Junior hesitated. You ain't got to. Behind me. The footsteps stopped right outside the bars. Someone jingled a key. That chilled Thomas more than the darkness. Inmates don't carry keys. Unless someone gave them one. The lock clacked open. The cell door creaked. And a voice stepped through the shadows. You Thomas. Thomas recognized it. The same tone he'd heard during D Suite's last hour. The man who had slipped out early. The quiet one who didn't talk much. He had the same cold certainty in his voice now. I'm not hiding, Thomas said calmly. If you got something to say, say it. The flashlight lifted, and the man's face appeared. Hard jaw, eyes like cut glass. My brother died confused, the man said. And confusion is pain. I need to know who caused it. Thomas didn't flinch. He wasn't betrayed. He was overwhelmed. Someone used him as bait. The man lunged forward, grabbing Thomas by the collar and slamming him against the wall. Junior gasped in the back of the cell, frozen. You calling my brother stupid? The man snarled. No, Thomas said through gritted teeth. I'm saying he was set up, same as me. Silence. That made the man pause, but only for a moment. You think I'm going to believe your word? He said. You think I came up here for a bedtime story? Thomas didn't resist. Fighting would only make things worse. I think you came here for peace, Thomas said. But stabbing the wrong man won't give it to you. The man's grip tightened. I ain't stabbing. Not tonight. One of the others behind him handed something forward. A sock weighted with metal. A lock in a sock. Deadly. Silent. The kind of weapon meant for slow damage. Thomas exhaled once. He'd known this could happen. He'd accepted it long ago. But he wasn't dying without speaking the truth. You want the one who set your brother up? He said quietly. Then look in your own crew. Look at the one who walked away the moment things went bad. The one who didn't even try to pull him back. That hit a nerve. The man's eyes flickered. Just a fraction. But Thomas saw it. Who? The man demanded. He was with us that night. You know exactly who I'm talking about. The man's jaw clenched. His breathing went ragged. Because he did know. His brother had mentioned it too. Why he leaves so early. He ain't even looked back. The man lowered the weapon a few inches. But trust was a fragile thing in prison. Truth even more so. And then, just as the man's face shifted with doubt, the emergency lights flickered back on. The sudden brightness flooded the tier. Guards swarmed the walkway. Hey, step away from that cell, an officer yelled. The man froze. The others bolted. Thomas stood still, watching as the moment fractured. The man stared at him with something Thomas couldn't immediately read. Anger, confusion, maybe even realization. The guards rushed in, grabbing bodies, dragging men down the tier. The man didn't resist. He let the flashlight fall from his hand. Right as they cuffed him, he looked at Thomas one last time and muttered, "This ain't done." Thomas nodded once. I know, because this wasn't a story with a clean ending. Not here. Not in a place where shadows were currency and truth was a weapon. Still, something had shifted. D Suite's ghost wasn't gone, but it no longer pointed at Thomas. When dawn broke, the tier was different. Quieter. Men whispered when Thomas walked past. Not out of fear, but out of the unsettling respect reserved for someone who survived a night they shouldn't have. He didn't think of himself as strong or lucky, just present. And in prison, sometimes surviving the chapter was the victory. But stories like this don't close cleanly. They leave doors cracked, motives unfinished, enemies half-shadowed, and pacing just beyond the bars. And if you feel that pull, the way the air shifts before something big happens, good. That means you're ready for the next part. Because what came after that night was darker, louder, and far more dangerous than anything Thomas had faced before.